All right, hi everyone. Welcome to the Earth Day virtual stage. We're so glad to have you here. For this segment, we're going to be talking about the connections between voting rights and climate change and climate action. And I'll be the moderator. My name is Alyssa Shearer. I'm co-director of programming at March for Science and also a PhD candidate in biomedical research at Columbia. And I'm joined by two awesome guests, Alyssa Varga from the Union of Concerned Scientists and Saad Amer, who is the co-founder of Plus One Vote and also an expert on environmental science and policy. So I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit more before we get started. Melissa, you can go first.
Thanks. Yeah. Hi, I'm Melissa. I help to manage our science network at the Union of Concerned Scientists, so training scientists on how to effectively engage in policy and advocacy. And I'm also the lead organizer for Science Rising, which is focused on increasing STEM student voter turnout. I'm excited to be here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Saad Amer. I am a person who works in voting rights and in climate change. So I'm super excited for today's panel. I am a consultant to the United Nations, an expert reviewer for a recent IPCC report, and also the co-founder of Plus One Vote, where we mobilize young people and people of color to get out and vote. So super excited to be here and happy Earth Day.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And just so for a little bit of background before we get started, why we're talking about these things are in the past few years, there's been several lines of attack on voting rights in the United States, where there's been hundreds of bills proposed in almost every state in the US to somehow limit voting rights and voting access, and several have been passed. So last year in 2021, there were 33 laws in 19 states that were enacted that made it more difficult to vote in a variety of ways. And this included purging people from registered voter lists, reducing access to voting by mail, interfering with election administration in local elections, and also things like reducing polling locations and hours. So all of this obviously makes it more difficult to vote for people. But also in recent years, we've been seeing a lot of rollbacks on environmental protections. And this hasn't been just the past few years, but for a long time, there's been a lack of real political will to enact policy that will effectively slow the warming of our planet. And so we want to talk today about how these things are interconnected. And so Melissa and Saad are perfect for that to inform us. And so the first question I have for the two of you is a general question, but I want to ask who these voting restrictions are impacting the most, and also how does this connect to communities who are most vulnerable to climate change and to pollution?
I'm happy to start. I think when we think about the climate crisis, it's really important to understand how it's such an intersectional issue. And what I mean by that is the reality that climate change impacts the most vulnerable communities: Black people, brown people, Indigenous people, people of color, women, the LGBTQ, the poor, the most intensely. And so as we start to see the climate crisis unfolding across the world, we're really seeing those communities being hit the hardest and consistently hit the hardest. Now, there is an inherent irony with the reality that voting rights restrictions similarly target those same communities. We see people trying to prevent Black people, Indigenous people, people of color from being able to get access to the ballot. And we saw that so intensely done in Georgia as just one of the most obvious cases where we see voter suppression highlighted. But also, as you mentioned, over 400 bills in 49 states across the United States. Nearly every single state in this country has put forth some sort of bill to limit access for people to be able to get out and vote, and most often those communities. And so it's really important that people understand that as this crisis continues to unfold and as these restrictions continue to grow, we're going to see a lack of representation of the communities that are most impacted by the climate crisis being able to voice themselves and their problems. And that, when we're looking at a democracy, which is supposed to be run for the people and by the people, is a major, major inherent issue that we really need to be drawing more attention to.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, that not only are those most vulnerable communities seeing climate impacts, more directly in their everyday lives, and their votes are being suppressed, but because their votes and their voices are being suppressed, there are other impacts that they are also experiencing directly tied to their civil rights being suppressed. We know that health outcomes are tied to voting access. Actually, the Union of Concerned Scientists has published a number of different reports showing that the health of our democracy is tied to actual public health. And when people are not accurately and adequately represented by their decision makers, there are more negative public health outcomes. There are weaker environmental protections that then impact things like air pollution and, again, still public health. And so we are seeing the same communities who are directly and indirectly being attacked by voter suppression laws and through inaction on climate change. And so I think, what this panel hopefully is already showcasing is that these two issues are directly connected. And that's why we need science advocates and scientists to get involved, not just on climate change, but also on advocating for stronger voting protections and healthier democracy bills at the state and the federal level.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for explaining that so well, both of you. So that leads me into another question, which is, there's certain things, especially some things at the federal level, like the filibuster, that limits impact that we can have. And that is something that has both been connected to impeding civil rights, but also impeding our ability to fight against these rollbacks on environmental protections. Saad and Melissa, could you tell us a little bit more about that and how that connection works?
Yeah, I think ultimately things like gerrymandering, the filibuster, all of these voter suppression laws, they are designed to make it harder for people to be represented at the federal and the state levels. And I think what's also important to call out is that this is a deliberate tactic to make sure that power is concentrated in a limited number of people who are not representing the voices of the majority in this country, who we know support action on things like climate change, and clean energy, and on strengthening our democratic institutions. So I think while there was rightful attention on things like the filibuster and all of these terrible voter suppression laws, it's also important to think about them as part of a whole, which we can address through things like federal legislation. We can talk about a number of those laws that were promoted, but just knowing that this is an intentional tactic and there are things that people can do to take action to strengthen these institutions and fight back against these tactics.
And that's a really great point, Melissa. And I also want people to understand that we are at such a pivotal time in our country, where at least right now we can see so much of our government for the first time really supporting such major transformative climate legislation and voting rights legislation. So, and that comes really clear in President Biden's Build Back Better agenda, where he has allocated several hundreds of billions of dollars for clean energy, but can't actually get that bill passed as a result of the filibuster blocking any real substantial action. And the same is true for the Freedom to Vote Act. The same is true for so many other major bills that would alleviate a lot of these big problems. And so when people look at the government and say, oh, well, nothing's happening, why isn't anything changing? The reality is those levers are in our hands to pull. Right now, with this year's midterm elections, we'll see the swing of Congress, of the Senate, of the House of Representatives up in the air. And what happens there will determine what climate policy and voting rights policy looks like all the way through to 2024. And so it's really important for everybody watching to understand that that's on us. That's important for us to get out and vote. Whatever it is you believe should happen in the next several years on climate policy, it's your duty to get up, get out and vote and to organize in your community. These things aren't just going to magically happen. We are seeing that there is a lot of support and that most Americans do support this. And in fact, what is it? Like 2/3 of Americans are alarmed or concerned about the climate crisis. So we're reaching record numbers, pivotal numbers on the climate crisis right now. And so it's really important that we take that momentum and that we show up and we show out and we change things to actually deliver and can finally overcome obstacles like the filibuster.
Yeah, awesome, thanks.
And if I could
Melissa.
actually just add one more point to that, because I think Saad brought up a really important idea that like there are a lot of terrible things happening, right? Climate change and voter suppression, but in 2020, we saw record numbers of voters turning out, including especially among younger voters who were turning out at rates that we literally hadn't seen previously. So we need to keep that up in the midterms, and we need to not be daunted by these proposed voter suppression bills and really step into our power and recognize what we can change if we do turn out to vote, not just in the midterms, but every year in every election, and stay engaged and keep applying the pressure so that we can see these transformative bills and actions across the federal level and the state and local levels as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that leads me perfectly into the next question, where I was going to bring up how we saw this record younger voter turnout, but also among some of these communities that we've been talking about that are most impacted by climate change, they tend to be the voters who are most concerned about the effects of climate change and wanting to, make progress on those issues. So I guess my question is both how can we all, do this organizing that you're talking about and getting people involved, but also help to amplify the voices of these communities that are both being targeted by these voter suppression bills and are also being influenced by the effects of climate change.
I mean, part of it is that I think if you care about climate change and the climate movement and climate action, you have to get out and vote. There's no other way to look at it. And while it's important to organize around climate policy, climate priorities, and all that good stuff, it's also important to put that same amount of energy into organizing for our democracy. If we don't have a sustained, functioning, healthy democracy, there is no climate action. There is no climate policy agenda. It's not going to happen. And so if we don't have both of these systems working, we don't have either. And so it's really important that people understand that it's on us to make that change. And for me, my background is in climate policy and in climate, but after a while, I started to see how there was such a fundamental disconnect between all of those things that we need to see on the climate crisis and people actually showing up to the polls and making sure that they're voting on those issues, as well as other issues like issues on social justice and voting rights. And so if we don't start connecting all these different pieces, and if we don't internalize those actions and organize in our communities, these major changes that we need to see are not going to happen. We would frequently hear since 2020 how we have 10 years to cut our carbon emissions in half. Now it's 2022. And that number of 10 years is 8. And that is slowly dwindling and dwindling by the day. And we are nowhere on track to half our emissions by 2030 at all. The idea of getting to a world where we're limiting the warming of the earth to just 1.5 degrees Celsius is becoming more and more of a distant future. And the further off of a dream that becomes, the more people suffer, the more people die, the more we see sea levels rise and species go extinct. And so it's really important that we understand that our vote can counterbalance all of that. And organizing in our communities is such a powerful way to empower ourselves and the people around us. But if we don't do it, it's not just going to happen. I wish it would just happen. I wish it was just faked. I wish our policymakers could just sign a little thing and then it's all done and here we go. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And we know that because if it was so easy, it would have been done already. And so it's on us to keep on building up that momentum and that pressure to make sure changes on climate policy actually happen.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I want to highlight some of the work that my colleagues are doing at the Union of Concerned Scientists to train scientists to organize with environmental justice communities, not just on voting rights, not just on EJ issues, but on both together, because as Saad said, they are interrelated. And it is not just about turning people out for this election. It is about organizing and building relationships in impacted communities so that we can continue to, as a scientific community, support them beyond just the midterms. It is, we are all in this together. And so thinking about ways that you can get involved in organizing efforts in your community, I think is one way, beyond just voting, of course. And there are so many great organizations who are doing this work on the ground. So if you are not plugged into them already, I encourage you to get involved. There's no better time than today.
Yeah, thank you. So along those lines, Saad, would you like to talk a little bit more about Plus One and the initiatives there and how people could plug into to that to get involved?
Totally. So I co-founded Plus One Vote in 2018 ahead of the 2018 midterm elections. And the goal with Plus One Vote is we sort of stem from one fundamental question. Who's your plus one? Who is the one person that you, literally you watching right now, are going to register to vote? The one person that you are going to bring out to the polls, the one person that you're going to add into the movement to help build that momentum. And by understanding that power in organizing at least one other person, people really take this transformative approach in relational organizing and making a difference. So with Plus One Vote, we organize mass trainings to help people understand how to register other people to vote and how to organize in their own communities and get people civically engaged, particularly on the issues that young people care about most, like climate change and social justice. And so whatever issue it is that you're passionate about, there is a place for you in the movement, place for you at Plus One Vote. And we're really lucky to be able to organize with such incredible people like our friends here at March for Science, to be able to organize on the ground and make a difference and really build up that power as we go into the midterms this year. Who's your plus one?
Yes, I will say we need to wrap things up, but I have been both very inspired and motivated by both of your organizations. Actually heading into 2020, I just texted some friends that I've had friends for a long time, but we just never really talked about voting, and two of them actually weren't registered to vote, and I got them signed up, so I had plus two. And so I'm just saying that so you guys watching know that like this is a thing that you can do. It's very easy. Just text your friends, ask them, and send them a way to register to vote online to get them involved. And then also Union of Concerned Scientists has this wonderful Science Rising program as well, which encouraged me and others at March for Science to do voter registration on our campuses. So any students watching, that's another great thing that you can do to try to get your peers registered to vote. And we, both Science Rising, Union of Concerned Scientists, and March for Science, we're all happy to help you in organizing any type of voter registration drive. So just reach out if that's something you're interested in doing. But so with all that, thank you both for being awesome and so informative and also inspiring to us as well. And we really thank you for your time and everything that you're doing to try to make climate change and climate action something better.
Happy Earth Day!
Happy Earth Day.